Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are so excited to have you join us tonight for an incredible program with William Barber III on environmental injustice, race, class, and climate change. This is a program by the Sierra Club of North Carolina, is our host, Western North Carolina Sierra Club. I am chair, and we have partnered now with William Barber III to bring you this wonderful program. He is with the Climate Reality Project and the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, and he wanted you to know, oh my gosh, they have just finishing up a training on climate reality with 5,000 people throughout our wonderful global environment. So he is exhausted and happy to be here and glad to interact with us. Our next online program, we have every first Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. We're turning to the election. Absolutely, you guys know it is time. This fall's election, stakes could not be higher for the environment. This is with Ken Brame, Western North Carolina Sierra Club Political Chair. You once again need to advance register. The link is right now on the website for Wenoca.org. Election day is coming up November 3rd. We are sending out emails and we are requesting you to make sure that number 2, you confirm your registration status. This is a perfect, simple link to look it up. NC voter lookup that you need to register to vote if you cannot confirm your registration. And that is a simple register to vote as well with ncvoter.org. The early voting dates, we're expecting 60% of our folks to actually vote in person, October 15th to October 31st. But that means 40% of our folks are going to absentee ballot vote. There is a new application. This just came out September 1st. This is very simple. It's an online. This is the link. You can go into our chat and you can pick up this link. You have to be able to sign with a touchpad or with your mouse on your computer. But the tried and true way is go online to the Board of Election. Again, ncvoter.org, print out the form, sign it, return it, either in person or by mail or by fax. Go to our website, wenoca.org, and we will again explain all of this to you. When you actually get your ballot, and do you believe this? The ballots are going to start being mailed out tomorrow. So if you are one of those lucky people who requested it a long time ago, it may get to you next week. You don't have to vote by absentee ballot. And if you decide to vote in person, whichever gets to the Board of Election first is what will count. Please know that we would like you to not be slap happy and vote without knowing who you're voting for. We want people to vote all the way up and down the ballot. We are going to be sending out Sierra Club endorsements next week to all of our email list. We want you to go on to wenoca.org. They're posted right now. And we would like you to reach out to your personal contacts and forward the endorsements, to have them forward on to their contacts as well. We are very proud in Western North Carolina that we help elect people in very narrow elections. And so we want you to vote every single candidate. And we are certainly endorsing the environmental candidates. We have a political fundraiser. Certainly money helps. And on September 15th, again, it will be a Zoom online at 7 p.m. The contact is down at the bottom. Again, it's in the chat box, Ken Brame, and there's a phone number, and we will have an amazing lineup. Our Secretary of North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, Michael Reagan, just knocks your socks off. And all of our endorsees, Ronnie Chatterley of our state treasurer, Jenna Wadsworth for agriculture, all of our North Carolina legislature, our Buncombe County Commission, all of those folks will be present. A plug on the census. Only 60% of us have completed our census. You know how important the census is. It is what provides the allocation of funding for a huge number of our programs, also our representation in Congress. So please go to my2020census.org and tell everybody you know, just check in with them. Have you completed the census? So now I want to tell you that we will take questions and answers at the end. Please put them in the Q&A box. Do not put them in the chat box. Do not raise your hand. And I will feed the questions to William at the end of the program. So now William Barber III, Environmental Injustice, Race, Class, and Climate. And welcome, William.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thank you to the North Carolina, Western North Carolina Sierra Club. And thank you to all of you for tuning in tonight. I'm so glad to be with you. As Judy mentioned, we at the Climate Reality Project are wrapping up our second global climate leadership training, where we've worked with over 5,000 people from across the world working on this issue, the environmental crisis of our time. I'm proud to say that we are wrestling with the same conversation that you all are wrestling with tonight when we talk about race, class, and climate change, and how the climate crisis serves as a multiplier on deep-seated social inequities that have plagued our society for too long, and how in our response to the climate crisis, we have an opportunity to make good and to rectify some of those inequities. So we're gonna dive right in. I really wanna have just a casual discussion. In terms of loosening up the tension some, I'm going to ask that people just drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. I'd love to see it, love to see who we're reaching, and look forward to building movement all across our great state of North Carolina. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to share my screen here and get us. Here we are. And get us started. Give me 1 second here.
Well, if you can see, William, people are putting in that they are from all over the United States. So it's not just North Carolina, it's from Vermont to California, Philadelphia, it's just all over, but certainly North Carolina. So, all right.
So glad to see that, so glad to see that. I'm working on, let's see, we're gonna get us settled. Give me 1 second. I'm working on getting this presentation to pull up so we can have it. And we'll jump right in. Great. Judy, can you all see that?
Yes, William, thank you, we can.
Okay, great. All right. So I first want to start the conversation with some grounding information. You all may be very familiar with some of the technical aspects that we're going to touch base on, so we're not going to spend too much time on some of the background of the climate crisis. But I think it is important as we start this conversation to always root us in the reality of what is happening here. So the first slide that you see here represents the billion metric tons of carbon that are produced. And you can see this represents that the main source of global warming by far is our consumption of fossil fuels. So that's the oil, that's the coal, and that's the gas. And if you're a student of history, you'll notice that the critical point happens right after World War II, where the use of fossil fuels quickly and dramatically increases. And we see the release of CO2 in the atmosphere begin to increase dramatically as well. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, very much in the corner, you'll also notice that we had about 3 years where emissions were actually stable, but now, unfortunately, they're going up again. So this slide represents a pretty alarming statistic. I've quoted it in a number of conversations, but what we know is that CO2 is being released into the atmosphere faster than at any time in at least the last 66 million years. I personally think that that's just incredible, and it shows the situation, in which we find ourselves. This next slide, similarly alarming. Right now, if you take the accumulated amount of man-made global warming pollution in the atmosphere, what we know is that traps as much extra heat as would be released by 500,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours, 365 days per year. That is an incredible amount of energy. And that energy is what's leading to the warming of our planet that is being trapped as a result of our actions as our dependence on fossil fuels. This slide represents a simple bell curve. And what it shows is just the distribution of what you would think would be so-called normal temperatures, on the Earth. It's chosen at a period arbitrarily between 1951 and 1980. Those were years where things, were just, an arbitrary normal period of time. The blue represents your cooler than average days. The white represents your average temperature days. And the red represents your warmer than average days. As we shift to the next slide, we see that the entire data set shifts towards the warmer side. In the lower right-hand corner, you also see the first time, or the emergence, of this darker red color. And this represents the first time we begin getting a statistically significant number of extremely hot days. As we continue to progress, we see that the curve shifts again, further to the warm side. And what we see is that there is an increase in those extremely hot days as well. Again, same slide, same reality. The entire data set shifts, to the warmer side. In the last few years, the extremely hot days have actually become more numerous than the cooler than average days. What that means is that we have cool days. We still even have some cold days, but the preponderance is that we see days that are warmer than average, hotter than average, and extremely hot. In fact, extremely hot days are now almost 150 times more common than they were just 30 years ago. And you'll notice that the extreme temperature events used to cover only 0.1% of the Earth. Now they've progressed to covering nearly 15%, right at 14.5. Another slide that just shows the reality of the situation. 2018, at least 224 locations all across the globe set all-time heat records. This demonstrates what we know is happening. This lines up with the science. When we talk about seeing those data sets shift to the warmer side, when we talk about having those extremely hot days, those hot days and those above average temperature days, these are the realities. It results in hotter days, all-time heat records all across the globe. We talked a little bit about the global. Now we're starting to move the conversation a little bit to the regional. what we know is that in this century, the southern United States, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Florida, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, the areas where we find ourselves, where our families live, our friends, our loved ones, the southern United States is projected under a business as usual scenario to warm by more than 8 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know if by that self it seems significant, but let me tell you, that is incredibly significant when you talk about impacts to the region, impacts to the environment, impacts to our society, if this actually happens. Using Atlanta as a staple, one of those, bastion cities, if you will, in the South, we see that in Atlanta, the 30-year moving average shows what's happened since 1970 and what's going to happen based on that data. You see this steadily increasing curve demonstrating the reality that our days are getting warmer, our temperatures are getting hotter, and this is the future that we have ahead of us. Quick graph here. Historically, the number of days per year above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, historically, Atlanta has seen 7. When we look at what's happening in the next 80 years at the end of the century, Atlanta is projected to have nearly 85 days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. What's more important is that we see that is not an isolated incident. As we said, this reality is indicative of what we can expect all across the southern United States and really in many places across the entire nation. And as we saw in the slide before, in many places across the world. Continuing to really zero in on the regional impacts here. We know that of the 100 counties in the United States projected to suffer the worst impacts of the climate crisis, 97% of those are in the South, most of them in the Southeast. This is incredible. And I think it, in our opinion, it creates the context that when we talk about the urgency of this moment, the South has to be explicitly referenced. When we talk about regional leadership on the climate issue, we have to talk about continuing to cultivate broad and bold ideas here in the South. It is imperative when we think about the urgency and think about this being our reality. This is just a quote from the National Climate Assessment of 2018, and it basically, and it says, as you can read, the American South and Midwest are expected to suffer the largest economic losses due to climate change. Economic losses from extreme weather, climate-induced extreme weather, have already totaled $653 billion over the past 2 years alone, with that projected to increase. There were 16 extreme weather events in the United States in 2017. There were 14 in 2018. Extreme weather events such as your heat waves, your drought, your heavy rain, your floods, your hurricanes, and your severe storms. This results in extreme economic loss, not to mention the loss of human life. This is an incredible, critical situation. So this slide, I'll let you all watch what's happening here. But this represents projections of soil moisture as we move throughout time. The darker the brown, the drier the soil moisture. If you look at our areas known for agricultural production, such as the breadbasket in the United States, such as the Southeast, you can see the severe impact that we can expect. And this has huge implications when we talk about state economies that depend significantly on agricultural activity, has huge implications when we talk about food security for communities and people. It has huge implications when we talk about the exacerbation of hunger amongst communities that already either live in food deserts where they do not have access to quality food, or as a result of economic burden, cannot find ways to feed themselves. Here are some figures in terms of percent yield declines that we know that happen based on the warming of temperatures. For each 1 degree Celsius of warming, we see a decline of 7.4% in yields for corn, a decline of 6% in yields for wheat, a decline of 3.2% in yields for rice, and a decline of 3.1% in yields for soy for every 1 degree Celsius of warming that we see. Again, huge implications here because these 4 crops make up 2/3 of human caloric intake worldwide. What are some of the challenges that cause these declines? Well, 3 most prominent ones that we know are heat stress that impact crops, new pests, that with pests having greater access in terms of range and being able to travel further, and expanded ranges for diseases. Speaking to some of those extreme weather catastrophes that we mentioned here, this is a graph of worldwide extreme weather catastrophes by the numbers of events from 1980 to 2018. So here you see your extreme temperatures, your heat waves, your droughts, your fires, you see your floods, you see your mudslides, you see your storms. We know that these are all exacerbated by our climate crisis. We know in 2018, there were about 850 natural catastrophes recorded around the world, with overall losses totaling over $160 billion. Incredible, incredible costs, incredible costs. Bringing it back to that regional impact, what do we see and what are we expecting to see in the Southeast? We know that the area burned by lightning ignited wildfire is projected to increase at least 30% by 2060. So wildfires, a phenomenon which we may have some dealing with, but in isolated cases, is expected to increase on an unprecedented scale. This is going to cause, more problems for us, more loss of life, more physical damage. Running through now some additional impacts. We know the 3 highest volume U.S. rainfall events on record have occurred in recent years. And where have they occurred? In the Southeast, 2017 with Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Louisiana, 2018 with Hurricane Florence right here in North Carolina, 2016, a spring storm in Louisiana. These extreme downpours are sometimes characterized as 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 year events. The reason is that these terms reference the probability that such an event should occur in a given year based on the historical average. In some cases, we've seen regions experience multiple 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year events in one hurricane cycle or in one season. To that point, this is a map that shows the rainfall over North Carolina during September 14th to 17th, 2018, when we were dealing with the impacts of Hurricane Florence. We know climate change influences hurricanes in several ways. We know that increased temperatures, increased temperature of waters, disruptions of the jet stream all lead to impacts where you have higher intensity storms forming more frequently and moving more slowly across areas and dumping unprecedented levels of rain. And you can see the white here represents areas that experienced a greater than 1 in 1,000 year level of rainfall. Again, this point is another reason why I think we have to really talk about Southern leadership, Southern action in addressing the climate crisis. We know that 3 of the top 5 biggest carbon polluters in the United States electricity sector are headquartered right here in the South. They are Denergy, Southern, and Duke. So when we talk about ways that we actually operationalize moving to a clean economy, when we talk about, who and where are the levers that we need to push, we have to be clear here that there are major actors in our region that we have to hold accountable. So that is some of the laying of the foundation, the technical aspects, the reality of where we are. I now want to move to a little bit of the justice conversation and want to start with some definitions. So here you have the definition of environmental justice, and EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, regardless of color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Environmental justice is achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and has equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, to learn, and to work. Climate justice. This is a new, fairly new, and an evolving lens, and it's a narrative which makes the connection between our present environmental crisis, our present climate crisis, but other socioeconomic crises as well. Climate justice forces an understanding that the climate crisis, yes, is an environmental issue, but is also a social and economic issue. This lens focuses on the root causes of the climate crisis, including an economy that has historically been heavily dependent on the exploitation of fossil fuels, and communities when you talk about where the fossil fuel infrastructure is sited. It looks at deeply embedded structural racism and other social inequities, such as economic injustice, gender injustice, even lack of access when you talk about community resilience to insurance or other recovery mechanisms. Climate justice calls for solutions which center the priorities and the voices of our most impacted communities in our conversations. And there are key components here, which means we think about this crisis as being people-centered. Yes, it is technical. Yes, it is a scientific issue. Yes, it is a matter of policy and investments in technology, but it is also people who are impacted. Climate justice forces us to acknowledge that. We also have to acknowledge disproportionate impacts. Many times, the reality that is articulated of the climate crisis is that it affects us all, regardless of who we are. And that is absolutely true. However, because of deeply embedded inequities, there are disproportionate impacts where frontline communities, poor communities, communities of color, rural communities, indigenous communities are impacted first and worst now. And the greatest harm of the climate crisis is that those communities, which in this moment face the real harmful physical manifestations of the climate crisis, have often for generations borne the brunt of environmental injustice by being the places exploited to feed our dependence on fossil fuels. That is the disproportionate impact that we have to talk about. And then finally, a climate justice narrative forces us to identify the intersecting oppressions and issues. So when we talk about the climate crisis, yes, that is where we start in this movement. But we also must understand how the climate crisis intersects with the crisis of poverty. We must also understand how the climate crisis intersects with the crisis of our democracy. We must also understand how the climate crisis intersects with the crisis of systemic racism. So this slide just represents some critical dates when you talk about a history of the US environmental justice movement. But rather than going over the dates, I really want to highlight that when we talk about the environmental justice movement, there are three things that I like to keep at the front of my mind and that I think are important when we have conversations around environmental justice and seek to understand this piece. One is that we must understand the connection between the leadership and activism of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the beginnings of the environmental justice movement as we know it in the United States. Two, I think we must understand that the fight for environmental justice has only existed in recent history and is very much an ongoing struggle. This is not something that we've solved in modern history and we can push to the side. This is very much an ongoing conversation, an ongoing movement for justice. And three, that as we see our environmental movements, as we see our environmental organizations really taking a hard look and wrestling with how to operationalize concepts of justice and equity, we have to look at the groundwork that was laid historically by leaders, oftentimes community leaders on the ground. To the first point of the connection between environmental justice activism and that of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Historically, civil rights leaders have always had a keen awareness of how environmental issues have intersected with the struggle for civil rights. Between 1967 and 1968, Dr. King's narrative of the three evils of racism, militarism, and poverty helped lay a foundation for the type of inter-issue analysis fundamental to the environmental justice movement. He did that by painting a picture of the unique sets of injustices that communities, especially poor Black communities, were facing all across the nation. James Farmer Jr., another civil rights leader, said it more explicitly when he declared that everything we hope to do with voting rights, everything we hope to do with civil rights, everything we hope to do with addressing poverty would be for naught if we do not save the environment, because we will all experience the equality of extinction. It was practiced explicitly in the activism of that period. Whether you talk about the early 1960s, when Latino farm workers led by Cesar Chavez were fighting for workplace rights, but also for protection from pesticides and farm fields. Whether you talk about Black students in Houston in 1967 who led local efforts to oppose a garbage dump sited in their community. Whether you talk about 1968 in West Harlem, where residents protested a sewage treatment plant in their community, unsuccessfully, though they sowed the seeds of further leadership, there has always been an element of civil rights leadership connecting the fight for civil rights to the fight for a clean and a healthy environment for all. I also want to say that when you look at the timing of the rise of the broader environmental movement in the United States, which has been timed to start as early as the 1960s or 1970s, that activism was directly linked and directly influenced as well to the civil rights activism of the same period. Another date, here you see highlighted, February 11th, 1968, the Memphis sanitation strike. Many people are familiar with Dr. King's role there. What is often less underscored is that many regard this as the first time that African Americans mobilized a national, broad-based group to oppose what they considered environmental injustice on a national scale. This was an incident where Dr. King and others advocated for better working conditions and pay for striking Memphis, Tennessee garbage workers. September 1982, another date. Many of us are familiar. Warren County, right here in North Carolina, the Warren County sit-ins represents the second time that African Americans mobilized a national nonviolent protest. And in this case, it was against a PCB landfill right here in Warren County, North Carolina. We know that over 500 environmentalists and civil rights activists were arrested, and the protest was unsuccessful in halting construction, but it was successful in becoming widely understood to be the catalyst for our national environmental justice movement. The grassroots organizing is key. The grassroots organizing is key. I also want to highlight that the data is key. Many times communities were well aware of the disproportionate impact or the harms that they were experiencing long before they had the data to actually demonstrate the reality of what was going on. And two dates speak to that point and really highlight how grassroots activism is critically matched with the collection of data and looking at disproportionate impact. June 1983. In June of 1983, prompted by the 1982 Warren County sit-in, the United States General Accounting Office conducted a study, the first of its kind, entitled Siting of Hazardous Waste Landfills and Their Correlation with Racial and Economic Status of Surrounding Communities. This was the first major study that provided empirical support for the claims for environmental racism on the ground. The study looked at 1980 census data and documented in its findings that 3 out of 4 hazardous waste landfills examined were located in communities where African Americans made up at least 26% of the population and family incomes were significantly below the poverty level. First incident when the data was collected to demonstrate the realities that communities were facing. That was followed by a 1987 effort where the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice looked at the statistical relationship between locations of hazardous waste sites and the racial and socioeconomic composition of communities nationwide. This study found that over 15 million African Americans, 8 million Hispanics, and half of all Asian Pacific Islanders and Native Americans resided in communities with at least one abandoned or uncontrolled toxic waste site. This study was incredible. It was groundbreaking. It was the first of its kind to address those inner issues that we've referenced of race, of class, and the environment on a national scale. The study also noted that the socioeconomic status of residents appeared to play a critical role in the location of hazardous waste sites, and that residents' race was the most significant factor when you looked at the variables that were actually analyzed. And then I do want to make a note of October 1991, out of honor to the leadership of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. They held that in Washington, D.C. It was a 4-day conference where several hundred Native American, African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific conferees attended and put forth and adopted what we now know today as the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice as a comprehensive platform for national and international movement of all people. I want to be clear here. When you look at the birth of the environmental justice movement as well, understand it was always an interracial movement. There was leadership for all races, Native American, Indigenous, African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific, and even white allies helped put this forth, helped bring this about. That is a critical piece so that we do not try to silo our conversations of environmental justice or climate justice to just one community. These are conversations that we all must be having. Give me 1 second now. Having a little, in terms of advancing the slide, we'll get settled here very quickly. Okay. Thank you all for your patience. Give me 1 moment while we try to figure out this bug. There we go. Still no. Okay. We'll just do it this way. Can you all see that all right? We'll see if it'll allow us to go full screen in 1 moment. Now, when we talk about the impacts of the climate crisis, we talk about why these conversations for environmental justice, climate justice have always been necessary. It's because of the reality that many of us already know, that directly impacted communities already living and breathing, suffering under environmental racism are also disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. We're going to go through a set of about 4 overlays, and I'm just going to ask you all to pay very close attention to the regions in which you see hotspots. So this first overlay, based on census data, represents percent Black or African American population for non-metropolitan counties. And if you look, you see these significant hotspots. And if you're a student of sociology, of history, you notice that this darker area where you see this upturned semicircle, if you will, represents an area known as the Black Belt. I was reminded by some of my public health colleagues that unfortunately, it is also an area known as the Stroke Belt. And you see regionally, a lot of these hotspots exist in the southeastern United States that we have been referencing. Now, this overlay represents, based on census data, percent of populations living in persistent poverty. And I'd ask again that you just pay attention to the hotspots. Now you see the emergence of some hotspots further out west. Many times what we have found is that tracks with the locations of indigenous reservations, tribal reservations and whatnot. But you also see significant hotspots concentrated in the Southeast. This next overlay represents the number of billion-dollar weather disasters from 1980 till 2019. So again, this represents your extreme weather and where they're happening. And finally, we're returning to a slide we saw before. This overlay represents the spread of those extreme heat days across the United States. Why is this important? When you look at these overlays one by one, it tells of a critical situation. But when you look at them together, I think the results are more alarming. You find the concentration of hotspots in the Southeast. I think that is one narrative. But you also must ask yourself, do the exercise of when we talk about where the majority of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters are happening, the most extreme cases. Then when we talk about the communities that are facing these disasters, many of them, most of them, quite a number of them, are living in areas plagued by persistent poverty. And then when we further the conversation and recognize that many of those communities are also communities of color, this draws the reality that our climate crisis is hitting communities, Black communities, brown communities, rural communities, Southern communities, poor communities, right now. These are the individuals who are on the front lines. This is important exercise for me because it allows myself to picture who, when we talk about the present climate refugees, who, when we talk about the person losing their home to flooding, who, when we talk about the person, the family suffering from extreme heat, who are they? What do they look like? And in doing this exercise, I think we avoid the travesty of just referencing those groups of people as just the anonymous they. Just, the individuals, the poor, the individuals out of sight, out of mind. It is imperative as we address this crisis, as we build this movement that I do believe will be successful, that we center people from these areas in our conversations. This slide is just a brief quote by, this slide is a brief quote by Pope Francis, in which he noted understood, made a point of saying, that the greatest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest among us. And that's the reality. That's the reality. We have to, in our response, understand that reality and behave accordingly. So here is just a brief Department of Defense warning back in 2014. So back in 2014, governmental departments really knew and saw the potential impact of climate change and said that climate change would likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic, disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions across the globe. Maybe 1 second, I'm going to see if we can go full screen again. Great. To that point, one of the issues we see exacerbated by the climate crisis is our immigration crisis. This is from the Lancet Countdown report of 2018 that said the world could see up to 1 billion climate migrants. That's a huge issue when we talk about exacerbating existing political tensions, when we talk about, a crisis that we have not yet, even begun to scratch the surface on, without climate exacerbation. When you ask the question of where are many of these refugees, these people coming from, we can look back at the drought map and see that oftentimes when you talk about the context of the United States, they're coming from an area in Central America known as the Dry Corridor. The Dry Corridor, this represents a region that is made up of areas of Honduras, of Nicaragua, of El Salvador, of Costa Rica. But the situation is that these people here have gone many times without a harvest for a year, sometimes 2 years. So people aren't just fleeing, normal situations. They're fleeing, major issues of food insecurity. They're fleeing, major issues of drought. They're fleeing, major issues, trying to figure out how to make a livelihood in situations that they have not historically had to face. Again, to that point, what the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies said is that the main reason people are moving is because they don't have anything to eat. Hunger is a huge multiplier when we talk about this. Seeing tremendous climate instability that is radically changing food security and causing major issues across the region. And I think it's of note here, when we look at where these instances of climate-induced migration are happening, they're often in areas known as the Global South, often areas that track, again, as countries that are Black countries, brown countries. That has to be a part of our understanding of climate justice, who are being impacted now in this present moment. Quote here, the 2018 report, the Lancet Countdown, made a note that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. Next slide represents just some different ways climate change affects your health. We look at here 4 categories: your rising temperatures. Of course, that results in your extreme heat, your extreme weather. Of course, that results in, displacement and property loss and infrastructure damage, in lack of clean water, risk to clean water because of contamination. And that has other impacts. Look at your air quality impacts, right? Increased pollution and smog, ground level ozone, increased allergens. And then, of course, vector-borne diseases. All of these are major ways that your health, is impacted by a changing climate. And when we talk about justice, what we know is that those health impacts disproportionately impact low-income people and communities of color. Take extreme heat, for example, one of those incidents. Extreme heat events cause more deaths annually in the United States than all other extreme weather events combined. And we know that there's a disparity when you talk about who dies from extreme heat-related causes. This is from the EPA, and this is death rate based on extreme events. And you can see that there is both an age and a racial disparity in terms of morbidity from extreme heat cases. Associated with extreme heat is, of course, the increase in the range of insects, that can carry diseases, the increase in the range of, those vector-borne diseases. Vector-borne diseases, heat stress, air pollution, waterborne diseases, they all are influenced by a changing climate. On the point of disease, some brief talking points. The number of U.S. tick-borne diseases cases has more than doubled from 2004 to 2016, and mosquito-borne infections have increased nearly 10 times. We're in the middle of a public health crisis with COVID-19. This in of itself has the potential to be a public health crisis. Another stat, when you talk about the impacts for people living in poverty, as many as 12 million Americans living in poverty may be suffering right now from an undiagnosed tropical disease, a disease never seen before. Why? Because it did not have the range. Temperature situations did not allow it to promulgate. Now we're starting to see all of a sudden unidentifiable diseases. Another way climate impacts our health and has the disproportionate impact is the air pollution that we mentioned. More than 3/4 of African Americans in this country live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. This slide represents the yearly death per 100,000 people from existing power plants. These are the power plants that are emitting, 15 million metric tons per year. Over 3,000 deaths each year are attributed to fine particle pollution, from these power plants, and represent a dramatic reduction from previous estimates. We know African Americans in the middle of this reality, one of the most concerning thoughts is that the Trump administration has rolled back rules on harmful pollutants, including mercury from power plants. This effort, this action was opposed even by the utility industry, who the rule would claim to benefit. That's reckless and it's dangerous, and it has real crucial ramifications for communities who are already suffering from levels of environmental injustice and pollution. We know African Americans are 3 times as likely to die from particulate air pollution as the overall population. We know African Americans are exposed to 21% more air pollution when you look at levels at the particulate matter 2.5 than the overall populations. Hispanic Americans are exposed to 12% more. The percentage of African American children suffering from asthma is nearly twice that of white children, and their death rate is 10 times higher. These are realities when you talk about air pollution that exist now and are threatened to be exacerbated by an unaddressed climate crisis. These communities are less able to prepare, to respond, and to cope with these impacts of climate change on health. And that is further exacerbated when you talk about inequitable access to healthcare and other factors. This slide represents tracking, that people of color are exposed to more air pollution. The beige represents areas where exposure for Black people is less than or roughly equal to white persons. The orange represents where there's slightly or significantly rather higher exposure. And then the red represents areas where there's more than 2 times higher exposure. So when we look at the very real reality of the climate crisis, when we look at the very real reality of the implications and the threats to us as a region, and then when we look at the communities who are bearing the brunt of this crisis, who are being hit first and worst now, who are disproportionately impacted, this is why we've embraced at the Climate Reality Project. This is why we're embracing through the Poor People's Campaign. This is why, as a movement, I believe it is so important that we're embracing these notions of climate justice. The reality is we cannot solve this crisis without climate justice. And there cannot be any climate justice without serious conversations around racial and economic justice. So some steps on how do we actually operationalize that? What does that mean for the conversations, that we're trying to have? For me, it represents a moment where we actually need to have a little bit of a back to the basics. As we are having the incredible conversations around solutions in terms of what can be done to meet this moment, I fully believe that those conversations can only be successful if we embed these concepts of justice, of equity, of inclusion, not on the margins, but at the heart of our policies. And I believe this moment that we find ourselves in represents an opportunity not only to solve, the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, but to set the seeds in building a more equitable and a more just society for all of us. So one place that I encourage us all to kind of gear our conversations is to become familiar with the principles of environmental justice. You see the 17 principles right here. We'll drop the link in the chat. I'll let you all read that. But I think these principles help set the tone in terms of what our solutions need to actually do and embody to really get us on the path to building a successful movement. Another place to look for some ideas, to look for inspiration, to look for conversations, is I want to highlight the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. Again, you have leaders, some of the same leaders who were at the original development of those 17 principles of environmental justice have come and reconvened to talk about how do we really make good on these calls for equity, on these calls for justice, on these calls for practical solutions that put communities first, but also move us towards a just transition towards a clean economy. Take a look here and find some ideas, of people who are really wrestling with this. I would also ask that you take a look at the moral policy agenda by the Poor People's Campaign Jubilee platform. What I appreciate about this platform is that this embraces that inner issue analysis that we spoke about in the legacy of Dr. King, where we don't allow our movement, our climate movement, to be siloed as just one issue or one movement. We have to recognize that the fight for our environment is connected to the fight against systemic racism and for justice. That is connected to the fight for a fair economy and for workers' rights. That is connected for the ending and demilitarizing, our society and ending this culture of war profiteering. These issues are connected. And this is a moment where even if we find ourselves engaging in our lane of work, we may be committed. I'm personally committed to engaging in the climate crisis, but I must understand how this work has to intersect, with the larger movements for social justice. In that is the only way that we can be truly successful. So that was a lot of the impact, the call to action, the urgency of the moment, but I also want to end, with some elements of hope. What we know is that 24 states representing a majority of the American people have formed the United States Climate Alliance. These are calls for significant climate action and indicate that our nation is really ready to lean into this movement and to push us, in the right path. What we know is that more than 70% of US voters support requiring 100% of electricity in their state to come from wind and solar, renewable sources by the year 2050. It's incredibly indicative and shows that our movement, our narrative has the potential to work. What we know is that commitments to 100% renewable energy are spreading all across the nation, gaining steam. And my friends, what we know, I really believe, is that if we make the commitments to ask the hard questions about race, about class, about this crisis, and to not accept easy answers in this moment is too critical. I truly believe we can all commit ourselves to building a successful climate movement that embraces all of us, that secures a future for our children, and that allows us to begin to rectify some of the injustices and inequities of the past. With that, I will say thank you. I will end my screen share. I will pass it back to you, Judy, for any questions.
Well, William, you are a great inspiration. Thank you. We had a number of questions saying, oh my gosh, how do we get these slides? How do we continue to see this recording? And a couple of answers. The recording will be available on Wenoca.org. It is being recorded on Facebook, and I think it will be on YouTube, but look at Wenoca.org. So question to you, William, are some of these slides, can you send them so that we can post them on Wenoca.org and some of these links so that people don't have to go through the whole recording to somehow get a very specific slide?
We can share some of the slides. It would help me if people have specific requests. I don't know how we can facilitate. I'm happy to take emails, certain information, but we can facilitate that offline.
Okay, you're comfortable with me putting your email on Wenoca.org?
Yes,
correct?
please. Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So, and the recording will probably take 3 to 5 days, and it's Labor Day weekend, so look towards the end of next week for the recording. A lot of people said, how can I share this with the teachers in my school? So, William, you certainly have created a fire in people's hearts. So thank you, absolutely. So first question, and you ended with the question of hope, but for you personally, what gives you hope both for justice and for climate? What sustains you?
Absolutely. I think, one of the first pieces is when you look at just the growing consensus of movements of leadership, especially amongst young people who, I want to just give a shout out to so many young people in our climate movement who are making sure that we commit unapologetically to these issues of climate justice, of equity, that they cannot be separated from one another. That tells me that we've done a hell of a good job in investing in the next generation of leadership and that our narrative is moving in the right direction. That's the first piece. The second piece is when you look at, especially the information shared on those 3 slides, there are concrete examples, when you talk about the brass tacks, that shows that we can win this. Majority of American people, want action on the climate situation. Majority of American voters want renewable energy as their primary source of energy. I think we can have a majority of American voters also understand the importance of embedding climate justice in that narrative if we get out and do the work. Those 2 pieces for me are incredibly inspirational, if you will, for this moment, and give me a hope that we are, finding ourselves building capacity and really moving in the right direction. One last piece is when you also look at the technology, the trends in technology, we're seeing where the cost of production of solar panels were, 5-10 years ago, it is coming down in monumental, exponential terms. That hopefully gives us the ability to really talk about putting forth solutions in scale, in mass, in a way that really, transitions our economy, to a clean and a green economy. So those 3 elements are really what I look to in my personal inspiration.
Thank you, William. And I want to point out with your slide of the communities that have committed to 100% renewable, Buncombe County was on there, Asheville City is on there. We've passed 100% resolutions. It culminated July 21st, just a month or so ago, where Buncombe County passed $10.3 million in bonds to put almost 50 solar installations on public schools, city and county government buildings, and we are so excited. And we want to give a shout out to the youth of the colleges, to high schools, to the whole community for getting petition after petition, signature after signature, and appealing to the commissioners, the county, and the city, and it happened. This is the work you're talking about, I assume.
Absolutely, absolutely. So proud of the work.
Great. So a couple of very specific questions. Number one, back at the turn of the century, the leveling of the greenhouse gases, what caused the leveling? Was it policy or was it a freak of nature? What leveled it out?
I don't know that I have an explicit answer. I mean, I've done some reading, surface level to this. I've seen, some people suggest policy maneuvering. Some people have suggested, that was the beginning of a consciousness where people really, I guess, got spooked at what we were seeing in terms of the levels of emissions. So I don't know, that I personally have a clear explanation. What I do know is that I hope we can see a more long-term leveling off, in the very near future. So.
Great. Question two, as for quote unquote extreme economic losses due to climate change, would you give a couple of very specific examples of an economic loss in particular?
Is that looking at what are economic losses, just to clarify?
Well, you gave billions of dollars. Can you just pick out like one or two economic losses, like the hurricane, or I don't know,
Yeah, I guess, when you look at for example, impacts of North Carolina, and take the impacts of Florence, that was on the level of impacts. In terms of the economic loss that our state saw, it was on the level of impacts of billions, right? It was unprecedented. When you talked about the results of this storm, not only being high intensity, but literally loitering over our state and being able to just dump rain, consistently for days. That led to major issues with flooding, major problems in terms of infrastructure. Areas, roadways were washed away, bridges washed away. You have, when you talk about the commercial animal feed operations in the eastern part of our state, several places were inundated, and you had impacts and sludge, impacting the local waterways. You had coal ash pond impoundments that were inundated, that were flooded and then resulted, in impacts and damage downstream. So these impacts are real, and they're happening more frequently. And, I'd be happy if there's a question where someone would like to see a list of like explicit numbers. I'd be happy they can email me and we can provide some of those resources.
Great. This person is asking to somehow help make, in the upcoming debates, climate change as the #1 issue. And there is a petition at www.climatepower2020 that we can put on our website if you'd like to sign that petition. Do you have a comment, William, as to how to influence the upcoming debates into focusing on climate change?
Yeah, I'm actually a part of the, in terms of the climate power efforts, I'm a part of the North Carolina State Advisory Board. So, I'm very familiar with that effort. I think my comment would be twofold. I think one is absolutely finding ways that we, individually continue to amplify our voices, signing the petition, getting on social media, educating those in our peer groups on the issue, and really pushing decision makers to take this seriously. I think that's how we drive the narrative. That's how we drive momentum. But two, I would actually flip that premise again. I think we have to be careful. Climate is the critical issue of our time, but it cannot be the number one issue, if I'm making sense. That's why we have these notions of climate justice. We have to understand that we're living in a time, I've referenced it as the crisis of our climate, the crisis of poverty, crisis of democracy, crisis of systemic racism. All of that is forming this unique moment of crises where if we're going to respond, if we're really going to meet this moment, we have to understand the concepts of intersectionality as coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. We have to understand the concepts of fusion political organizing, as coined by the Moral Movement here in North Carolina. It is not one issue that we must articulate. It is all the issues, and we must build a movement that addresses them all in order to be successful.
Great. Question on methane leaks from fracking, natural gas production, distribution systems, food waste. How important a contribution to climate impacts is methane?
It's incredibly important. And I think, it's actually very sinister because methane, associated with natural gas pipelines has oftentimes been framed as a clean or an alternative fuel. Methane, depending on the study, has been looked at and evaluated to be up to 70 times more potent than carbon dioxide when you talk about heat trapping ability, when you talk about greenhouse gas ability and effect. We really need to move our economy away from any combustion, any fossil fuel source, and really look at serious investments in solar, in wind, in demand side management, in sources that get us as close to natural processes as possible. That's the moment we're in. That's the urgency of this moment. So we cannot afford accepting false solutions, if I may, in this moment where we need real pragmatic answers, responses of the crisis that we find ourselves in.
Okay. There are a lot of people tuning in from California and the West, and they're saying, hey, they've been aware of indigenous rights and actively working with tribes for a number of decades. To what extent here in the Southeast have the indigenous folks who somehow escaped the Trail of Tears, et cetera, been included in the general discussions?
I think they've been included in their own leadership, and what I mean by that is that, indigenous folks have always been at the forefront of the fight for environmental justice, of the fight for climate justice, of the fight even for biodiversity. When you talk about, natural solutions, indigenous populations represent 80% of biodiversity, even though they represent, I believe only 3% of the population, so in their own actions, they have been included in the conversation. Now, the converse of that is those conversations have too often been inaccessible for those same leaders. Too often they've been excluded when you talk about the policy decisions. Right now, one issue that we're leaning into with the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign is standing with an indigenous group, the Lumbee tribe out of North Carolina, the largest indigenous tribe in the state, in opposing, the Piedmont natural gas facility that's being sited in Waukulla in Robeson County. Why? Because when we often see where these projects are sited, two things: they're fast-tracked, and the impact to the surrounding community is oftentimes, not fully considered, especially when you talk about indigenous populations. And two, we cannot allow our land to be sold out to this fossil fuel infrastructure, because what we allow to be built now is what we're going to get tracked into for the next 5, 10, and 15 years. Understand, we're against a massive time curve in terms of really meeting, this moment with ambitious action. And so we have to stand and oppose, these projects when they disproportionately affect communities and, when they affect us all.
Are the Black Belt and the Stroke Belt the same as the Bible Belt?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Okay. Are there dedicated government committees addressing climate change at state, county, municipal levels in North Carolina and elsewhere throughout the Southeast?
Absolutely. So, you know, in North Carolina, we have the Clean Energy Plan that was put forth as a result of Executive Order 80 back in 2018. In terms of environmental justice, the Department of Environmental Quality has the Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board as an advisory body to really talk through and help advise the department on how to operationalize, again, some of these concepts of equity, of justice, and of inclusion. Those are the two places that I've been, you know, most a part of and would encourage people to take a look at, because I really do believe, to the point of Southern leadership, North Carolina has a unique opportunity to set the tone, to do the right thing, and to make sure that in our solutions, we build a better state for all of us.
Outstanding. Question on the boycotts, 1963 Birmingham boycotts in particular. What role do you see the boycotts and what learning, and would you recommend more for climate justice movement?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you look at the direct action associated with the boycotts of the 60s, again, when you look at the inner issue analysis that was embodied in civil rights activism, where when you're talking about communities, they were facing a plague of issues, not just one. I think that's important for us as a climate movement when you juxtapose it to the direct action we've seen often in opposing fossil fuel pipelines, but also to the narrative that we have to continue to cultivate. This crisis has the potential to affect us all. Absolutely. But I think we cannot stop there, you know, in our analysis. I always have to push it a degree further and say it's not affecting us all in the same way. And again, how does it multiply on those other crises? We don't get ambitious action on climate without solving our democracy crisis. Understand that. We don't get solutions that protect all of us as a nation, as a community, as a world, without solving our justice crises. We don't get to a just transition on clean energy that allows new economic opportunity for all and avoiding recreating inequities if we don't talk about economic justice. So those lenses, that type of inner issue analysis, has to be embedded and at the forefront of our movement in this time around.
Okay, William, I think we're coming down to the end. A question about insects and the spread of infectious disease, global crisis status. Pesticides are a problem. Do you have a recommendation on insect prevention?
I do not. I am not the expert on insect prevention. I think that is a excellent question. If there are individuals who would like our assistance in maybe identifying some of those resources, I will share my email with you, Judy, and we can see what that conversation yields.
Well, thank you. We've had a notification. We have currently here Blue Horizons Project in Buncombe County, focusing very clearly on clean energy and climate change. If you have questions, please go to wenoca.org. I am going to share William's email and whatever slides that he feels comfortable sharing. And William has offered very graciously to reach out and partner with North Carolina, the Southeast, and Western North Carolina. So we're going to continue these conversations. William, you are an inspiration. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening. We'll be in touch.
I do want to share with you our next program, October 1st. We'll be focusing on the election, what you can do. We need you to reach out to your personal contacts. We need you to help with the election by passing on Sierra Club endorsements, by helping, if you're comfortable, helping out the endorsement cards at early voting sites, or just by passing on through your personal contacts. Please advance register and please continue to be involved. So thank you one and all. Thank you for sharing with us this lovely evening. Good night, William, and good night, one and all. Thank you.